One of the terms that we've all become very familiar with over these last several months is that term asymptomatic. The term, it describes someone who, although they may not be physically displaying symptoms, they may still be carrying the virus and probably even spreading it to others. And this had to change the way we thought early on, right? We were so focused on the physical symptoms of a virus that many of us thought that we were safe as long as we didn't display them. But the truth is that the virus lay right below the surface. See, I think Jesus is telling us about something very similar in our passage when it comes to our hearts this morning. Many of us think that as long as we don't display any physical symptoms of sin, that our heart is in good condition. But Jesus is saying that isn't always the case. We as Christians, we can be guilty of focusing so much on spiritual symptoms. And what I mean by that is that we can be guilty of simplifying our relationship with Jesus down to a list of do's and don'ts. And as long as we, find ourselves in church on Sunday morning, as long as we aren't out getting drunk the night before or cursing out our neighbor, as long as we aren't committing the acts that we define as serious sins, we assume that everything is okay. But when we begin to look below the surface, we find things aren't as picture perfect. And we know this. We see desires in our hearts that we're not proud of. Thoughts that come into our mind that we wouldn't want to share with anyone. Maybe when we're alone, when no one is around, we do things that we would be ashamed of if they came out. And maybe we think that we can appear to be right. So we put on a show with outward actions and outward words, and we give the appearance that we are righteous. But deep inside, we know the truth. See, Jesus' words are like an arrow to the heart of every pretender. Jesus' words in this passage are a heart to the arrow of every one of us in this room this morning. Here's what Jesus wants us to know. He wants us to know in our passage that righteousness, true righteousness, runs far deeper than just our actions, but true righteousness runs deep within our hearts. And the good news of the kingdom, the good news of the gospel, is that Jesus isn't just interested in changing our actions. Jesus wants to change our hearts. Jesus doesn't just change our actions. He changes our hearts. So if you're not there already, I'm going to ask you open up to Matthew chapter 5. And as you're turning there, let me just say, this is why I preach the way I preach. Sometimes I like to give you just a little glimpse behind the scenes. This is why I have the philosophy of preaching that I have. We just systematically go through portions and sections of Scripture, because here's what it does. It forces us to deal with tough topics. It forces us to deal with topics and passages that, we'd rather just avoid this one. It forces me as the pastor. I don't have control. Whatever the next passage is, that's what we're talking about. Doesn't matter if it's Thanksgiving or not. We're talking about a tough topic, right? So we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, and it is a tough passage this morning, and so grateful for Ariel for reading that for us. So I'm not going to read it again. I just ask you to turn there, 21 to 30. And as we're looking at it, I think as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, it's so important for us to see it as a whole. So often when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's presented to us in sections, right? And we forget that this was a whole long sermon. And what we're reading in this section and what we'll be examining over the next few weeks is a carryover from what we read last week, right? Do you remember what Jesus said in the previous section? He said two things. He said, number one, that he has come so that the law and the prophets would be fulfilled, right? He came so that the law and prophets would be brought to their intended purpose. So we see that there in verse 17. So we just skip back. You see verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And we said what he meant by that in part is that he had come to reveal the full intention of the law. He has not come to bring a new law, but a fulfillment of the law. And so that's what we see in this next section. We see this pattern of what Jesus is saying. He says this in different ways. You have heard that it was said this, do not anger, but I say to you. This pattern, this usage of words, all the way down to the end of this chapter, right down to the end. You have heard it was said, do not murder. You have heard it was said, do not commit adultery. You have heard it was said, divorce comes with a certificate. You have heard it was said, not to bear false witness, an eye for an eye, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. You have heard it was said, but I say to you. See, Jesus is showing us how he is bringing the law to its fulfillment. That's key to understand in this section. He's not abolishing the law, but you have to understand its intent, is what Jesus is saying. Your teachers have been teaching you falsely. So I know in the past, this is what's been taught to you in this way. But listen, this is what it really means. This is what God intended when he wrote that law. So we have to see that. We have to see that Jesus in this section is a continuation of the previous section. But number two, he left us on kind of a cliffhanger last week, didn't he? For I tell you, verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And we were left wondering, what does he mean by that? What does he mean that our righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees? Because these guys were extremely obedient to God's law. At least they seemed to be. Most of them probably knew the law off by heart. They could quote to you the whole first 5 books of the Old Testament verbatim. Obedience they had on a level that we don't see today, and I don't even think we'd be capable of today. So if their obedience isn't righteous enough to enter the kingdom, then what chance do we have? But what we found is that Jesus wasn't speaking about outward righteousness, but he was speaking of a righteousness that ran deeper than just outward obedience, but a righteousness that ran deep down to our heart's desires.
Set to the fault.
It was not enough to just physically abstain from committing a sin, but rather Jesus wanted to get down right to what are you desiring in your heart. And that's what he's getting at in these verses. He's saying, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. Let me tell you what this looks like. And this is what he's doing. He's explaining what this deeper righteousness looks like. Because what if I refrain from stealing, but I still want to steal in my heart? What if with my mouth I would never curse God, but I curse him every day in my heart? What if I would physically murder someone, but deep down I'm so angry I wish they were dead? What if I've never been physically unfaithful to my spouse, but with my thought life in my heart, I desire to be? Do you see the dilemma? The deeper righteousness that Jesus is speaking of. The issue isn't so much your actions. The actions are the symptoms of a deeper heart issue. The issues we desire in our heart evil actions, evil deeds. Jesus puts it like this in Mark 7, verse 21. He says it like this. He says, "For from within, out of the heart of men, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." Oops. The issue is what's in our hearts. We desire sin and we love it. Anyone with enough self-control can refrain from an action, but who can master the desires of the heart? Right? I mean, you hear people saying in society, the heart desires what the heart desires. That's the problem. This is the righteousness that Jesus demands from those who are to be a part of his kingdom. This inner righteousness is what Jesus is addressing here. And so in our passage, he gives us two warnings and then two ways to address those warnings. Two dangers and then two ways to address those dangers. Jesus gives us a warning here about anger. He wants us to guard our hearts against unchecked anger. And we see that in verse 21. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.'" And we get that, right? I mean, I'm certain there are very few people that would argue with that. If someone murders someone, they should be judged for that act. Murder is to take someone's life unjustly. It would be different if we were at war or if you were trying to defend yourself when someone was trying to take your own life, but that is different. But that's not murder. Murder is taking the life of an innocent person unjustly, out of anger, out of jealousy, out of hatred. And God's law is very clear about this. If you murder someone, you will be judged. But Jesus goes to give the fulfillment of that law. He says, that's right. I mean, that's a good idea. You probably shouldn't murder someone. But I say to you, don't even get angry with your brother. Don't even insult him. Don't talk bad about him. If you do, you are equally in danger of judgment. I mean, those are difficult words to swallow. Verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell." Feel the weight of those words. And think, who among us is not guilty of any of these things? Who among us has never gotten angry, annoyed, furious with someone, those we even love? Who among us has not whispered an insult, whispered a name under our breath, even behind someone's back? Who among us has not torn a strip off someone because we thought they deserved it, even if in our own minds? See, I don't think Jesus is saying that you're guilty of murder. But what he is saying is that each of these actions is deserving of the same judgment just as much as the act of murder. Why? Because it is deeply rooted in the state of our hearts. We might not murder someone, but we might wish they were dead. We might not murder someone physically, but we can murder them. We can tear them down with our words. We might not murder them physically, but we can ruin their reputation by spewing false accusations. Murder is not just destroying someone's life physically, but with our words, with our actions, we can destroy someone spiritually and emotionally. You know what's really interesting is I read a lot of commentaries and there's a lot of discussion about the different types of insults here that Jesus says and different definitions for what raka and fool means in some versions. But I think when we do that, when we're trying to decipher the difference and what type of insult, we're guilty of the same things as the Pharisees and the scribes. Like we're trying to dissect the minute details of what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying is clear. His point is clear. We don't need to dissect this down. He's saying your words have power. What we say to each other and how we say it, there's power in the words we speak to each other. Proverbs puts it like this. It says, the power of life and death is in the tongue. What that means is that if we, with our words, we have the ability to either tear people down or build them up. I mean, what damage can a few sentences do? What damage can a few words do to someone's confidence? Someone, how they view themselves? I mean, you think of the difference between a child that's been told all their life that they are nothing and they'll never amount to anything and they're worthless, compared to a child that's told you're special, you're loved, you're treasured. How quickly marital disagreements turn ugly once we start name-calling and hurling around accusations. And all we're trying to do is see who can hurt the other more than the other. In fact, those who are closest to us, those we love the most, are in a greater position to either cause spiritual life or death in us. Husbands, wives, do you know the power that your words have in the heart of your spouse? And so the question is, are we using our words to cause life or death in our marriages? Parents, do we understand the weight of our words to our children? We can affect the very direction of their lives with the way we speak to them. Jesus is warning us about the danger of unchecked anger. And I hear the voices, I hear the questions. Well, didn't Jesus get angry? Like, didn't he flip over tables and empty the temple? And I would say, listen, there's a huge difference between righteous anger, anger at injustice and sin. And that's the kind of anger that God shows. The vast majority of our anger is not a righteous anger, let's be honest. It's a selfish anger. Like we're angry because we didn't get our way, or we're angry because someone didn't agree with us. We're angry because someone's hurt our pride and our ego. That is unjust anger, and we are all guilty of it at one point or another. So what do we do? Listen, we're human. We're going to get angry. We're going to lose our temper. Jesus says, but then you need to deal with it. Address it, because if it goes unchecked, it can be dangerous. Jesus turns and he reminds us of the need for reconciliation. He warns us about the danger of anger, and then he turns and he reminds us of the desperate need for reconciliation. Look at what he says in verse 25. He says, verse 23, I apologize. If you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. Go, first be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. So in Jesus' time, the part of the worship of the Jews is that they would go up to the temple and that they would offer their sacrifice, a grain offering, a food offering, an animal sacrifice, and they would do that as worship unto God. And here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if you find yourself at the altar ready to give your worship, to offer your sacrifice, but you remember in your mind that you have wronged your brother or sister, you need to go and take care of that and reconcile with them before you come and offer your worship. Now let me put this in today's terms. Let me just be very clear. If you find yourself sitting in service on Sunday morning or getting ready to come to service, and it occurs to you that you've lost your temper or wronged your brother or sister in any way, it is better for you to get up and walk out of service, or don't come to church at all, until you go and you reconcile with your brother or sister. Then come and worship at the church. Why? Well, the reason is, it's because your heart's divided. There's division in your heart. And you cannot love and worship God with a divided heart. You can't compartmentalize your relationship with God and your relationship with people. They go hand in hand. And when one of those is out of sync, both of them are out of sync. It's why we read in John's epistle, he says, whoever says they love God but hates their brother is a liar. You cannot love God and hate your brother or sister. The issue isn't your worship. The issue, again, is your heart. And the big thing for us as humans is we like to make ourselves feel better by covering up our bad things with good things. We want to outdo the evil we've done with good things. And so we somehow think that even if we've been rude and unkind and angry with those around us all week, well, as long as we come to church on Sunday, it makes it all better. But Jesus is saying your heart is divided. And you cannot worship God truly with a divided heart. Listen, couples, families, why do you think that Sunday morning is the most stressful morning? We found that early on in our life together coming to church. Honestly, like how many of us find ourselves getting in an argument or a disagreement or losing our temper with the kids on the way in. And so we walk into church with this huge smile on our face and a God bless you on our lips. But below the surface, we're fuming. And we don't feel at ease in church because our hearts are divided. And the enemy knows this. Like, I'm convinced. Right? He knows that the greatest way to impact our sincere worship on Sunday is to stir up conflict. So Jesus says you need to deal with it. And sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's not. Like sometimes it's a quick conversation. You know what? I lost my temper. I said some things I know I should have said. I'm so sorry. And that's it. But sometimes there are deeper issues that stir up that anger. And so we need to take time, maybe a few conversations, to sit down, to dig past the surface, and to find out what that blow-up was about. I can't count how many times I have ashamedly lost my temper with my wife, my kids, and I've had to go back and say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. And even among our elders. Listen, we have a great godly board of elders, and it's not because we always get along. Sometimes we get in heated discussions because we're talking about serious things. And I know that we have godly men on our board because at times I'll get a phone call the next day and they'll say, Dave, I'm sorry. I said some things I shouldn't have said. and let my emotions get the best of me. And there are times where I'm on the other side of that conversation. I'm having to call them and say, hey, I'm sorry. I said some things I should have said. Because we know, right? We know that Satan will try to cause division. We cannot allow anger to go unchecked. We must face it. And Jesus says we must face it with urgency. We see that in verse 25. He says, come to terms quickly. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. Come to terms quickly. In other words, deal with it right away. Don't let it fester. Don't let it become bitterness, because these things have a way of progressing quickly. And when we let them sit, they're going to progress. Anger that goes unchecked turns into bitterness. Bitterness turns into hatred. Hatred turns into irreconcilable relationships. How many marriages have been broken up over words that turn to resentment? How many parents aren't talking to their kids and haven't talked to their kids in years over words? Siblings who haven't talked to siblings. Church members that have left. Churches that have split over words. Jesus is not saying deal with it or you're going to end up in prison. That's not the point. And so much as he's saying deal with it quickly before it escalates to a situation that you cannot control. He's warning the danger of anger. And then he reminds us of the need for reconciliation. But then he turns to another hard issue. The issue of lust. Jesus warns us of the danger of lust. We see that in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I mean, let's be honest, this is a damning statement to our society. What does it say to a society where sex sells? Where every commercial on TV is all about sex appeal? What does it say to a society that's become desensitized? We don't even see it anymore. We can't even notice it because we're desensitized to the seriousness of sexual sin because we see it on every show and in every movie and every song. We don't even think about it. What does it say to a society where 73% of women and 98% of men view online pornography on a regular basis? Listen, I know that we are in the midst of one pandemic, but there's been a pandemic growing right underneath us for years. It's a pandemic of men and women who find themselves addicted to online pornography. And mostly because we think, well, it's harmless. There's no victim in it. But it isn't long until we find it affects our self-confidence. It impacts our intimacy with our spouse because we're so used to artificial intimacy. We can't handle true, authentic intimacy. It impacts how we view the opposite sex. We view the opposite sex not as men and women made in the image of God, but as sexual objects. But we're so desensitized to the seriousness of it. I mean, how many broken marriages there are? Families, lives, because of pornography. But maybe that's not your problem. Maybe your problem is the friend you have at work that you spend probably a little too much time with, that you joke a little too much with, that you flirt just on the line of inappropriate. See, what we do when we do these things of this nature, when we flirt with online pornography or inappropriate friendships, we're placing ourselves in the enemy's backyard. I remember when I was a kid, I used to walk back and forth to school. Every day we'd walk back and forth to school. And you know how it is. You get to know the neighborhood. You find like little alleys and byways that get you home quickly. Well, there was this one alley that we walked down every day. And there was this huge dog. And he was on a chain. And he would come every day. And it wasn't like a nice dog that was just saying hi. Like it was growling and foaming at the mouth. And like I knew that if I was on the other side of that fence, my leg was getting torn off. And you know how kids are, right? So my friends would be like, hey, I dare you to jump over that fence. Just jump over and see if you can get back over before the dog bites you. Not me, man. I was like, no way, I'm not trying that. See, the probability is that I could probably jump over and get back over without getting bitten. But why am I going to place myself in needless danger? Why am I going to make myself vulnerable to be attacked? See, that's what we do when we view online pornography and allow ourselves to flirt with that line of friendship. We are placing ourselves in the enemy's backyard. We are making ourselves vulnerable to attack. We are placing ourselves in unnecessary danger. This, again, has everything to do with what's going on in our hearts. We can be physically faithful to our spouse, but in our thought life, with our imaginations, we can be extremely unfaithful. But Jesus is saying the two go hand in hand. Why? Because, listen, no one wakes up one day and says, I think I'll go have an affair. But it starts with a desire. A desire in the heart. And that desire leads to a wandering eye. And that wandering eye leads to a conversation. That conversation leads to, well, what if? And that wandering leads to places that there's no turning back from. It all starts with a desire of the heart. James chapter 1 puts it like this. It says, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. No one wakes up with the intent to find themselves in sin, but it starts with a desire. So Jesus, he warns us of the danger of lust, and then he reminds us of the need to have strong boundaries in our life. You want to protect yourself from lust, you need to have strong boundaries in your life. We all have to have these solid, strong, healthy boundaries. Look at what he says in verse 29 and 30. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. What's Jesus talking about here? Does he literally mean that we need to start dismembering ourselves in order to prevent us from causing sin? Well, I don't think so. I mean, even if you did remove your right eye, wouldn't your left eye still? And even if you did remove both eyes, don't you still have your imagination that can lead you astray? No, Jesus' words communicate exactly the point he's trying to make, because our reaction is, that's a bit drastic. That's a bit overkill. But that's the point. In order to protect ourselves from sin, we need to take drastic steps to keep our hearts protected. In other words, we need to have healthy boundaries in place. So listen, if your computer or your device causes you to sin, then maybe you need to get rid of it. And you say, well, that's a bit drastic, but so is cutting off your hand. And if there's a friendship that you have that is causing you to sin, then my friend, that's a friendship that you need to get rid of. Drastic action. It's that drastic, but sometimes it's establishing healthy boundaries to keep you accountable. Put boundaries in place so that you will never be unnecessarily in a secluded place with the opposite sex. Like, I have those same boundaries. I thought about sharing some of them with you, but you know what? Your situation is different than my situation. But I have boundaries in place in my life. Not because I can't control myself, because it keeps me accountable. You can look up the Billy Graham rule and see if there's, look that up online. More serious, boundaries around what we're viewing on a regular basis. Like, we need to be looking up online what we watch before we watch it. They've got websites where you can find exactly how many curse words, how many nude scenes, and all that before you watch it, so you know, I can't watch that. You're establishing healthy boundaries. Boundaries around our online viewing. For instance, there's software that you can get that filters out inappropriate websites. And you can have an accountability person. So for instance, if you find yourself tempted to go on that website one day, it sends an email right to your accountability person that says this person was on this site on this day. Not so it's like, aha, you're caught, but because it promotes healthy conversation around why did you go to that website? What's going on in your life that led you to go there? That leads you to finding an accountability person that will hold you accountable, that you can meet with. And they're going to ask you some tough questions, but they're going to journey with you through the process. And sometimes, brothers and sisters, you need to do some digging. Because pornography and extramarital relationships is usually a symptom of a deeper heart issue. Because it can be used just as any type of drug. It's an escape. It's a cover-up to stop myself from feeling this pain. It's an issue of control. It comes from deep-seated issues. And so sometimes we need to get some counseling. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need to find out why. Why do I self-medicate in this way? And let me just say, if that's where you are right now, I'd love to meet with you and talk with you. I'd be honored to sit down with you and hammer out a plan that we can have to get you some help. To talk with you about a plan to deal with this issue in your heart. Reach out to me. I'd love to meet with you. I'd be honored to meet with you. I mean that. Jesus warns us about the danger of lust, and he calls us to have boundaries. The questions we have to ask is, what is Jesus getting at here? What's his point here? Is his point just to make us all feel bad about ourselves? I mean, with Jesus' words in these verses, there isn't a person in here who isn't guilty of one or both of these. That's his point. Because by human standards, listen, these Jews believed that they were right with God. Let me put it in today's terms. I just want to put it in today's terms so you get the kind of conversation that's going on. Today the question might look something like, do you think you're going to go to heaven when you die? And the answer would be, well, of course. Why wouldn't I? I'm a good person. I'm a good person. I've never murdered anyone. I've never committed adultery. And those are good things, great things. But Jesus is saying, I don't think you understand God's requirements to get into heaven. God isn't just concerned about your outward actions. God's concerned about what's going on in your heart. So let's just examine your heart this morning. So you've never murdered. That's a good start. That's great. But did you know that even if you've gotten angry or cursed at someone, if you've ever torn someone down with your words and talked badly about them behind your back, well, you're just as in danger of judgment. Did you know that? And you say, well, you've never committed adultery. That's great. But have you ever looked at the opposite sex and lusted after them or desired to be with them physically, someone other than just your spouse? If you have, well, you're guilty of adultery in your heart. And our response in this conversation is probably, well, if that's God's standard to get into heaven, then no one deserves heaven because we're all guilty. And Jesus would say, now you got it. Now you understand. That's the point. The point is, it's meant to point us to the cross. The point is for us to feel the weight of our sin and recognize our need for the forgiveness of Jesus Christ at the cross. The point is for us to see that by God's standard and by our own effort and our own strength, we'll never measure up. And his point is, that's exactly why I have come. Because all have sinned and fallen short of God's righteousness. There is none who are righteous, not even one. And our only hope is by trusting in Jesus and his sacrifice and his resurrection for forgiveness and the righteousness that God demands. Listen, you're not meant to walk away. You and I are not meant to walk away from the Sermon on the Mount feeling like we've got it all together. If you do, you haven't read it right. You're meant to walk away from the sermon poor in spirit, humbled before God, mourning over your sin, and hungering and thirsting after the righteousness that can only be found in Jesus Christ. That's the point. We all fall short, and Jesus came to pay for what we lack. He came and died in our place so that we could be forgiven and we could be restored to that right relationship with God. God so loved the world that he gave us his Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish and die guilty of their sin. They will be forgiven and given eternal life. The point that Jesus is trying to do here is point us towards our need for the cross. Let's pray together. Father, so grateful for your word. It's like a mirror, and I just always think about sometimes we don't like what we see staring back at us in the mirror. Show us, God, that there's a way to fix what's staring back at us in the mirror. And the answer is not within ourselves. Help us, God, to see the answer is only in your Son, Jesus. God, I pray for the many lives that have been impacted by these words of Jesus and the conviction that is upon us, God. Help us to see that that conviction is a good thing. We are uncomfortable, but it's for a reason to point us towards you. And so I pray that's what Jesus' words would do this morning. We thank you for the promise that those who are in Christ, there is therefore now no condemnation for them. We thank you for those words. But we know, God, that there's work to do in our lives, that you have not called us to sit idly by. So there are those of us, God, who we've been called to action by these words. Help us not to just shrug or just take it as another convicting sermon, but let us be moved, God, to do the necessary steps to find the help that we need to find in order to rectify these hard issues, Lord. You desire inner righteousness for us, not just outward obedience. I pray you'd make that clear to us. In Jesus' name.